He predicted 3 great wars, famine and plague, which took hundreds of lives. He knew how the princes of England would die, and when French monarch Louis XI was going to die. In the 15th century, the whole world knew him by the name of Giorgio de Leopoli, the great astrologer, the teacher of Nikolay Kopernik, the rector of Bologna, the oldest university in Europe. In the 20th century, everyone discovered that Giorgio de Leopoli, Yuriy of Lviv, were the names given to the son of a craftsman of Drohobych Yuriy Kotermak. How did he manage to have such a career and become famous all over Europe? He was born half a century before Nostradamus, astrologer, professor of philosophy and medicine, personal advisor to the Pope. He had an incredible gift for prediction, but he only used it twice in his life. What is the secret of Giorgio de Leopoli? What made the famous European scientists give up everything and stop his practice for good? His incredibly accurate prophecies would later be compared to the foresights of Michel de Nostradamus, French physician and astrologer, who managed to predict the future for 6 centuries ahead. For many centuries, astrology examined the influence of planets on human life. Ancient astrologers interpreted this doctrine as a person born with an individual macrocosm. Since the very birth, this macrocosm is inseparably linked with movements of large and small planets. What sign of the zodiac were the planets in at the time of your birth? At what angle to one another? Knowing these positions at the time of birth, ancient astrologers could predict the fate of a person or even of a whole nation. They were prophetic people, and they could read the stars. Somehow, by using the stars, they could determine what a year would be like. For instance, was it going to be warm or cold? They even predicted various disasters. The greatest recognition in the field of foresight had received the French astrologer Michel de Nostradamus. He wrote his predictions in coded form. But hardly anyone knows that Nostradamus had a predecessor who was famous at the time. His name was Yuriy Kotermak Drohobych. The young astrology lecturer put his pen to one side and examined the map. The stars depicted on it were crossed by hundreds of lines, creating an amazing calendar of days and months. Events lined up in a clear line, but the results were frightening. Right before the astrologer's eyes emerged terrible bloody images. Watch later. He was born to a Salter's family. Then one day, something unexpected happened. When the moon eclipsed the sun and darkness engulfed the earth, Drohobych, a poor man, was hailed a genius prophet. We will witness a unique event which radically changed the life of Yuriy, a boy from the town of Drohobych. We will learn how he became the rector of the oldest university in Europe and the personal astrologer of the Pope. For the first time in history, we will unravel the mystery of his life and meanings behind his prophecies. We will track down modern astrologers and learn how predictions are created today. And together with astronomers at the observatory, we will see the unique phenomenon of a total lunar eclipse, in which the 15th century had so startled the little boy from Drohobych. In 1450, Mikhail Donat Kotermak, a poor craftsman and salter from Drohobych, had a son. The son's mother died during labor. She was buried in a small town cemetery, and the baby became half-orphan. His father named him Yuriy. As an adult, he continued the family craft, working down the salt mine. In those days, Drohobych provided the salt for half of Europe. On the blue shield of the town's coat of arms, there were 9 furnaces that symbolized the 9 salterns of the town. In one of these worked Yuriy's father. During excavations at the salt mine, it was confirmed that Yuriy Drohobych had worked there. And had attended school near the Church of St. George. The salt industry in Drohobych had been here for 6 centuries. Nowadays, salt water is sent through a huge pump to the boilers, where the salt is then evaporated. In the 15th century, salt production was incredibly hard work. A typical worker had to fill 10 buckets of salt a day. Salt water was extracted from the mine using buckets tied to a rope. To get a couple of pounds of salt, the water had to be boiled for a minimum of 5 hours. It has to be stirred non-stop to avoid precipitation on the walls and maintain a constant temperature. When the water evaporates, what remains at the bottom is salt. Within a few hours, the salt water made the skin on the hands turn white and crack. And we didn't even manage to extract a kilogram of Carpathian grey gold, which was the name given to the salt by locals. Mikhail often took his little son to the mine. Yuriy didn't complain. He liked to watch the magical work of salt workers who turned ordinary water into large grey lumps of salt. But his father dreamed of another life for his son. When Yuriy was 8, he took his son to a parish school. There, children from wealthy families were taught by clerks. They often teased the weird son of a craftsman because of his raggedy clothes and ill-fitting shoes. But he didn't care. At night, he used to secretly climb on the roof of the house, where he sat motionless for hours, watching the sky. In class, they laughed at him. Yuriy Donat is counting the stars. Nobody knew what he was looking for. Only his father understood. Mikhail Donat once told his son that souls of the dead went to heaven and were transformed into stars. And somewhere among the thousands of tiny bright spots shines the star of his mother's soul. This is what her little boy was looking for in the night sky. Education came easily to him. He quickly learned to read and write from an early age. Within a few years, the son of a poor salter had learned 4 languages and even worked as a translator for the Genoese merchants, who brought fabrics and sweets to Drohobych in exchange for salt. Yuriy dreamed that one day he would put enough money by so that his father wouldn't have to work so hard. But he didn't have time to release his father from his work at the mine. Underneath this wooden board there's a mine from which salt has been excavated since the princely era. Unfortunately, there's no way to get inside because the salt has corroded the iron so much that it won't move. But we can say for sure that Yuriy's father worked at this mine. In those days, workers reinforced the walls of the shafts with wooden beams. Sometimes, however, there were landslides. One day, the townspeople learned that a tragedy had occurred at the mine. When they arrived, they saw Yuriy Donat digging madly at the ground. It turned out that his father was trapped underground along with several other salters. Yuriy couldn't believe his father had been killed. Every night, the orphan gazed up at the night sky and talked to the stars. He was sure that his parents could hear him. The boy was asking for advice. He begged the stars to show him the future. Then, one night, whilst looking into the sky, he got the answer. Suddenly, the stars dimmed. They appeared to fade away before his eyes. And then Yuriy saw a big black disk covering the moon. Then, total darkness. 2008. On the night of the 20th to the 21st of February, we've got a unique opportunity, together with astronomers at the observatory, to see what 6 centuries before had amazed the boy from Drohobych, a total lunar eclipse. It was neither day or night. Now, I'm observing this rare phenomenon, the lunar eclipse. Its mystical effects have been exciting chroniclers for many centuries. It was considered a curse by kings and great commanders. And it's this phenomenon that 6 centuries earlier, the son of Drohobych's craftsman had seen. Preparations last for an hour. A hole in the roof is opened to reveal a huge telescope. The observatory is freezing cold. The room cannot be heated for fear of damaging the lens of the telescope. Now everything is ready. Together with the observatory worker, we see the black disk slowly move across the moon. It lasts for several hours, and then, for 25 minutes, you're plunged into darkness. Eclipses have been terrifying mankind with their portents for generations. Once, astronomers observed them from high towers without any devices. Those who were able to predict phenomena such as lunar or solar eclipses certainly had an influence on the masses. People feared eclipses heralded impending disasters and wars. Later, scholars explained that eclipses affect weather and tides. They can cause earthquakes, floods, tsunamis, and other natural disasters. Moreover, according to modern astrologers, eclipses can negatively affect people's lives, but only those born on the day of the eclipse. But most people feel anxious during an eclipse. Many subconsciously want to start some new business and change their lives. But Yuriy Drohobych was not scared of the darkness. In a few minutes, the disk disappeared and the stars were shining in the sky once again. But Yuriy was still sitting motionless. He couldn't explain what happened, but he was sure it was a sign from his parents. The long-awaited answer to his question. The next day, he packed his bags and left. He was never seen in Drohobych again. In 1469, a young man came to Krakow. He was wearing tattered clothes, and his worn-out shoes indicated that he'd walked a long way. In his pocket, he had 1 grosz. It was all that was left of his father's legacy. With this grosz, a Sultan's son, Yuriy Drohobych, was going to enter the Bologna University. In the university's registry, historians have found the name of a man from Drohobych, Yuriy Kotermak. The document also shows the entrance fee paid by him, 1 grosz. The entrance fee was officially 8 grosz. 8 grosz! Sometimes rich people paid up to 16. They made a special discount for him, so he paid only 1 grosz. At university, Yuriy found happiness for the first time in years. Finally, he was among people who shared the same views. Nobody scoffed at him. After a while, the nice, educated son of a craftsman earned the popularity and respect of his peers. Together with other students, he settled into a small hostel and gained access to a huge library, in which were stored the works of philosophers from the Middle Ages and antiquity. he marveled at the works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Aristarchus, and their descriptions of the structure of the world and distant cold shining planets. It was in Krakow where he began studying the science of the stars, astronomy. He accurately calculated the movement of planets and all the solar and lunar eclipses. It surprised people because at the time and later, even after his death, these prophecies came true. A high percentage of these predictions came true. It proves how skillful he was at predicting the future. Yuriy enrolled at the Faculty of Liberal Arts. Thus, in addition to astronomy, he studied music, grammar, geometry, rhetoric, and dialectic. In fact, the Faculty of Liberal Arts, Faculty of Philosophy, Astronomy and Medicine were joined together. They believed astrological predictions could help treat patients. University graduates could practice medicine and teach in any European academy. But Yuriy was interested in medicine much less than in the secrets of the stars, which he had been observing as a little boy in Drohobych. Soon, Yuriy Drohobych would receive a bachelor's degree, and at 23 would become a master. As the top graduate of the university, he would be offered an estate in Krakow and a position as a doctor. But he rejects all proposals. One day, Yuriy leaves Poland and with a small pack on his back, walks all the way to the Italian city of Bologna. In Krakow, students learned the basics of astronomy, and in Bologna, they could master the mysteries of predicting the future, astrology. At that time, it was the center of European science. Only the best studied and taught there. The University of Bologna had an enormous library, millions of rare books, and it was there where Yuriy Drohobych learned the secrets of science. The Renaissance was flourishing. There was rebellion in the world of science and culture. It was open to a man who, according to the church, had to live in misery for the sake of paradise in heaven. That he, a man and not God, is the crown of creation and the center of the universe, and the human mind and beauty are the most surprising things ever created by God. Bologna, with its small, narrow streets, resembled a huge anthill. Yuriy was scared for the first time. The city was different from the tranquility of Krakow, but the youth had never been so close to his dream. In the 15th century, to prepare an astrological prognosis, one needed an excellent knowledge of philosophy, mathematics, and geography. An astrologer had to know physics, do complex calculations, and be able to interpret the influence of the stars on the fate of entire nations. Astrologers had no special telescopes and instruments, but they could foresee the future better than their modern colleagues. Now, astrology is not considered a serious science. In newspapers and on television, there are daily and weekly horoscopes. Professional astrologers are skeptical about them. They say it's impossible to predict the fate of a man for a week or a day. It's all guesswork. I always examine the three elements: the year of birth, date of birth, and zodiac sign. And many other factors are taken into account. For example, what day it is. Astrology is an extremely complicated science. If someone wants to do something non-superficial, he or she needs to study not only astrology, but many other sciences. An astrologer from Ternopil tells us that he still follows the example of the ancient astrologer Yuriy Drohobych. After all, he was not just a man of encyclopedic knowledge, Drohobych had a rare gift, a high level of astrological intuition. What is the secret of ancient astrologers? And why aren't their modern successors able to surpass their teachers? Researchers cannot give a clear answer to this question. At that time, astrology was not commercial. The future could not be foreseen for a day, week, or month. And only educated and talented people could read the stars. First of all, those who had the gift of seeing what others could not. Yuriy Drohobych began to learn the art of making predictions in Bologna, and soon he became a lecturer at the oldest European university. The astrologer believed that due to accurate prophecies, it would be possible to warn mankind of approaching disasters and epidemics, saving thousands of lives. What could official religion foresee? End of the world. And by the way, this eschatology was very prevalent in the Middle Ages. Very often, they even predicted the date of the end of the world. People were preparing for it. Society was enduring psychological stress. And by the movement of celestial bodies, astrologers could forecast precise short-term predictions. If only someone could have made such a forecast for Yuriy's parents. They would have known about disasters and may now still be alive. For 4 years, Donat had been studying the laws of the influence of stars on human destiny. Then one night, he had a strange vision. An unknown city is burning. Children are crying. Between the destroyed buildings lie hundreds of corpses. Their swollen bodies are covered with terrible blisters. Down the street, a procession is moving with a triumphant cry. It is led by a prince with cold, fishy eyes. He is examining the dead city. Yuriy woke up. There was no doubt. That moment, the mysterious symbols and the hundreds of planets on the map formed into a single image. He realized the horrible vision was not a figment of his imagination. Everything he saw would happen in reality, and he knew exactly when and where. Then, Yuriy took his pen and made his first record. The kingdom shall be plagued by loss and obstruction in the year 1468, and there will be numerous diseases passed in the blood, an epidemic which one should avoid at all costs. A year later, the whole world knew that the Tsar of Moscow, Ivan III, had captured the capital of the independent state, the Principality of Novgorod. The siege lasted 3 months. When the Tsar's army marched into the capital, they found desolate houses. Everywhere lay the mutilated bodies of townspeople. It turned out that during the siege, the city's population was wiped out by bubonic plague. All this was predicted by the Ukrainian astrologer in Bologna. This was the first prophecy of the lecturer of astronomy. Under the manuscript prognosis, he would proudly put his signature, Yuriy Drohobych. Since then, he would never use his real name, Donat or Kotermak. In the university, he would be referred to simply as Giorgio de Leopoli, Yuriy of the lands of Lviv. Who ever heard anything of Rus? And he took this pseudonym and proudly declared that he was from Rus, from Drohobych, which of course was then very mysterious to Europe. At 28, he had already foreseen 2 great wars. He foretold that Russia would start a war with Sweden, and that Japan would fall into the vortex of civil strife for 100 years. Observing the movements of minor planets, Yuriy saw that a curse would soon befall Venice. A swarm of locusts would cover the city for a few days and destroy crops in the surrounding fields. The starvation that followed took more than 30,000 lives. The only copy of this forecast is preserved in the Department of Latin Manuscripts at the Bavarian Library in Munich. This work of the astrologer of Drohobych didn't reach Ukraine. Yuriy was stunned. After a few years, everything he had foreseen began to come true. The whole of Italy began to speak of the astrology lecturer. Soon he gained the title of professor, and when Yuriy turned 30, he was elected a rector of the famous University of Bologna. This was the highest honor. For the first time in history, the oldest European university was headed by a Russin. Around this time, the astrologer's talent aroused the interest of Pope Sixtus IV. Yuriy Drohobych met this man by chance when Sixtus IV was at the top of his career. After that, his life would go downhill. Watch later. At the request of the Pope, he would write his best prognosis. He would learn of how and when the princes of England and the French monarch Louis XI would die. He would foresee a war, a plague, and 50,000 deaths. But nobody would see these forecasts except the Pope. Why would he avenge his own astrologer? And what secret knowledge did Yuriy Drohobych give to his star student Nikolay Kopernik? He was born and raised in Drohobych, foresaw 2 great wars, plague in Novgorod, and a terrifying biblical curse in Venice. By 30, Yuriy Drohobych had had an astonishing career. A Salter's son from Drohobych became rector at the University of Bologna, the oldest university in Europe, and personal astrologer to the Pope. Each year, the rector of the University of Bologna prepared astrological forecasts for the Pope. In it, he had to glorify the pontificate and evaluate the following year. The only thing that the rector of the University of Bologna did not know was that all his forecasts were brutally censored by the Pope. When Drohobych first met Sixtus IV, he suddenly fell ill. This man didn't seem to be a saint. Sixtus IV had a piercing stare and sunken cheeks. On his way to the papal throne, he committed a lot of crimes. Before his appointment, several cardinals, the first contenders for the papacy, were killed under mysterious circumstances. But the guilt of Sixtus IV was not proven. After becoming pope, he received unlimited power, which guaranteed his impunity. Using God's name as a cover, the Pope committed horrible crimes and held the whole of Europe in awe. And for this man, Yuriy Drohobych was to make his forecast for the year for which the stars promised no good. 1483. The astrologer is working hard. At night, he stays up very late in the laboratory, examines the maps of the planets that will help him predict the future of the world. The 30-year-old rector of the University of Bologna had no idea that this prophecy would be his last. Yuriy put his pen to one side. The constant hard work made his eyes burn. But he could not stop. The horrific events foretold by the stars wouldn't leave his head. He saw 2 boys, and then the murderer's face. He heard a pitiful moan. He beat the floor with his fists. It's all over. The boys, his own nephew, were murdered by a nobleman in expensive clothing. A year later, the whole world would know. The 12-year-old King of England, Edward V, and his younger brother were strangled by 4 killers, by order of the boy's uncle and guardian. That same year, he inherited the throne and became King Richard III, but retribution was not far away. 2 years after the murder of his nephews, he would die. His death ended the long-lasting Wars of the Roses. The new King of England would be Henry VII of the Tudor dynasty. All this was forecast by the astrologer Yuriy Drohobych. But it was not the only thing he saw that night. Narrow cobbled streets, familiar squares. He has been here before, but he couldn't remember. Something has happened. Why are there no people? Wooden doors marked with crosses. Smell of rotting corpses. He doesn't want to see it. He must run away. Drohobych was breathing heavily. The vision haunted him. He understood it all. He was trying not to think about it. But he couldn't let go. The astrologer knew what would happen. He recognized that place. It was Milan. A year later, his vision came true. The plague wiped out hundreds of residents of Milan. Drohobych's hands were trembling. This year heralded another death, that of the French monarch Louis XI. Without a king, the country would be torn apart, but there were worse things to come. Following vision. Acrid smoke stinging the eyes. A huge crowd on the street. Horrible shrieks. The figure of a tall man with burning eyes, surrounded by figures in robes. This is the Grand Inquisitor Tomasz de Torquemada. He's calmly looking at the fire. There's a man. He's being burnt alive, condemned by the Supreme Council of the Inquisition, established under the patronage of Pope Sixtus IV. Stars showed the astrologer a vision of the future. It was Pope Sixtus IV who blessed Catholics to create a new Inquisition. In the terrible year of 1483, the pontiff would establish the highest general council of Inquisition. From that moment on, mass executions of Jews and heretics would take place across the whole of Europe. 11,000 people would die by approbation of Pope Sixtus IV in the fire of Inquisition. Exhausted, Yuriy Drohobych dropped his head. He could still hear screams. On that night, the rector of the University of Bologna witnessed thousands of deaths. Students who came to his lecture in the morning didn't recognize him. The 31-year-old professor had turned grey overnight. Because of a lack of sleep, dark shadows appeared beneath his eyes, and his hands began to shake. Drohobych foresaw terrible events awaiting the world. He took his most valuable work, the prediction for 1483, to Rome, hoping to change the future. It should have been sent to every kingdom. As he opened the first printed copy, he went pale. The book, called Predictive Estimate for the Current Year of 1483, had no record of the terrible events that would occur the following year. That is why Nostradamus tried to convey information in different codes. And by now, Nostradamus is interpreted differently. His centuries were actually coded. He had to consider sentences, numbers, and lines in order to grasp his point. He could not believe his eyes. Where had his honest predictions gone? In the printed version of the forecast, there was nothing about the plague, treachery, and the Great Inquisition, which would wipe out thousands of innocent people. A moment later, he realized what a terrible mistake he'd made. The astrologer had not coded his prophecies. He dared to openly describe the terrible events that lay ahead, some of which would be caused by the Pope himself. He lived and worked through difficult times of Inquisition. but he ventured to write it all down. At around the same time, Nostradamus was trying to encode his centuries. In fact, the attitude to such people was different, and he had big problems with this. Yuriy Drohobych suffered as a result of his overconfidence, and the astrologer was not forgiven. His prognosis was changed on the direct orders of the Pope. And after that, Sixtus IV ordered the censorship of all Italian books. Famous philosopher and writer Niccolò Machiavelli would later write, "This Pope was the first one who showed what great power he possessed and how easy it was to hide mistakes beneath the cloak of papal authority." Drohobych had never felt so devastated. Everything he'd been working on for so long had lost its meaning. He had learned to foresee the future, but under the conditions of papal censorship, it meant nothing. After that, Yuriy Drohobych would never revert to prophecies again. He burnt all the maps and manuscripts he'd been working on for so many years. Only once would he break his promise not to translate the language of the stars. Drohobych's career as a rector had ended. After the story of the published calendar, the disgraced rector received no job offers. From the large, spacious house, he had to move to a small apartment in a poor district of Bologna. His money was running out. The Krakow archives still have the letter written by the former rector of the University of Bologna to his last patron. He wrote, "I was destined to be poor, unhappy, and troubled all my life. My constant labor and tremendous effort is rewarded with a minuscule salary." In 1488, Drohobych receives a letter from Poland. The professor of medicine is invited to teach in his native Jagiellonian University in Krakow, and he returns there. The 15th century, the Renaissance, a time of great discoveries, of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Shakespeare, and Petrarch. For the first time, a man dared to doubt the truths preached by religion. It was then, when studying the works of ancient philosophers, scientists made an amusing suggestion. The Earth is not the center of the universe, and the Sun does not revolve around it. This idea was brought from Bologna to Krakow by great astronomer and new lecturer Yuriy Drohobych. In Krakow, lectures of Yuriy Drohobych attracted hundreds of students and other lecturers. They admired the talent of their infamous colleague. Once, after the lecture, a young man came up to the professor of astrology. It was one of his many students. The student's name was Nikolay Kopernik. After 30 years, he would revolutionize astronomy. He would prove that the Earth is only one of many planets that orbit around the Sun. In fact, the first time he heard of this idea was in Krakow from his teacher Yuriy Drohobych. After several years on the initiative of the Catholic Church in Poland, there began a mass persecution of professors and students who professed the ideas of the Renaissance. The humanists were confronted by conservative scholars and churchmen. They insisted that free thinking would return people to paganism. One cannot equally serve both God and Jupiter. Thus, progressive teachers were banned from teaching works of ancient philosophers. There were student protests. Yuriy Drohobych and his student Nikolay Kopernik continued secret studies in astronomy. In the midst of street clashes, Yuriy Drohobych would use his secret knowledge for the last time. He would foresee a great future for Copernicus. The student would surpass the master. He would make an astonishing discovery, which would begin a new countdown in astronomy. This would be a revolution in science, but Drohobych had no time to see it. On the same stormy year, astrologer Yuriy Drohobych died aged only 44. The professor was buried in Krakow. Hundreds of students, lecturers and humanists were present at the ceremony. Copernicus amongst them. After the funeral, Copernicus hastily left Poland and went to the University of Bologna, where his teacher had lectured. There, student Nikolay Kopernik would continue his education. In Bologna, he continued to study astronomy. The goal of his entire life would be to prove that the Earth was just another planet. That it is not the Sun that orbits around the Earth, as philosophers and theologians had believed, but quite the contrary, our planet orbits around the Sun. The theory suggested by Copernicus would start the scientific revolution. It would completely negate the doctrine of the Church. His work on the rotation of the celestial spheres would be called heresy and included in the lists of banned literatures. In 1600, a follower of his teachings, Giordano Bruno, would be burnt alive on the orders of the Inquisition. And the astronomer Galileo Galilei, who would give indisputable proof of Copernicus's teachings, would be persecuted and forced to renounce his words. But Nikolay Kopernik didn't pay for his discovery with his life. He would come up with an ingenious plan so as not to repeat the fate of his teacher. Having learned from the bitter experience of Yuriy Drohobych, Copernicus would hide his secret discovery until the end of his life. He would order his controversial scientific research to be printed only at the end of his life. Copernicus died, holding fresh printed copies of his book in his hands. Immediately after his death, the Church would ban the book, but it would be too late. After the release of Copernicus's treatise, a long war between science and religion began, and eventually the ideas of the Polish scientist and his teacher Drohobych would win through. Time would pass, and only in the mid-19th century, at the University of Bologna, would the full lists of its rectors and lecturers be published. And in these lists, everyone would see the name of the unjustly forgotten medieval astrologer, Assalter's son, Yuriy Drohobych.